Hello. As I said, thank you for joining. Thanks for booking onto this CCFG question time, our second CCFG question time, which we're really looking forward to. We've got a fantastic panel to answer questions that have already been submitted and people to put questions to the panel over the next hour and a half. We've allocated an hour and a half. Our last CCFG question was just for an hour, but we did have some feedback to say that it was cut short. So we have asked the panel to stay with us for an hour and a half. So it might not last an hour and a half. It might last an hour. Let's see how long the questions take, but I'm sure it's going to be good fun. Just to say that, you can attend these webinars for free. You don't have to be a member, but obviously we are trying to encourage people to join CCFG. It's a really busy time for us and we're trying to find our feet. We lost our late chair, Bill Mason, in June. And things have been a bit slow with the committee, just trying to find our feet, getting things going and trying to fill Bill's big boots in running this group. So please, if you can join as a member, it's £30 a year, free for students, £15 for graduates, and that gives you access to field visits and all of the information, literature, resources that we have on the website. And we're also really keen for people to get involved with the group on the committee organising events. So if you're keen either in Scotland with our committee in Scotland or in Wales or in England, if you're keen to get involved in organising field visits, we'd be really keen to make contact. Please contact Polly, email Polly if you're interested in getting involved with the group. So, okay, we'll make a start then. So on the panel today, we've got, I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'll just introduce them briefly. David Pengelly, who's based down in Wiltshire. And then we've got Andrew Leslie, who's based in Cumbria, and Hazel Cowan. And my Scottish geography is not very good, but I know she's in Scotland. So I'll hand over to maybe Andrew first to introduce him, and then Hazel, and then David. Thank you.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Andrew Leslie. I've been involved in forestry for about 35 years. Initially, I spent about 10 years in forest research overseas, which was everything through from sort of, I suppose, intensive plantations right through to natural forest management. I've then spent about a quarter of a century teaching students at Newton Rig, which then became the National School of Forestry. And then just about a year ago, I joined forest research with one of the areas that I've been asked to focus on being continuous cover forestry. And I see there's some familiar names in the list of participants. So can I say hello to everyone I know? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Hazel Cowan. I work for Cawdor Forestry and I'm based just east of Inverness in the north of Scotland. I've been working with continuous cover quite seriously for about 15 years and a bit of a dabbler in it for about 8 years before that. Mainly in Scots pine, with a bit of larch, working with strip systems and group selection systems. More recently, with the unavailability of larch and looking at diversity of species, I've been quite serious taking into having underplanting Scots pine of larch as a way of doing some more continuous cover forestry.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I started off studying agriculture, but having then followed it up with a year working in New Zealand, got inspired by forestry, came back to the UK and studied that. And then my career started in earnest in 1987 after the storm in East Anglia, been involved there. Then a period in the Chilterns with beech there and conifer on the Reading beds. Then moved back to Wessex in southwest England in the late 90s and set up a forestry and agri-environment consultancy business. In the forestry side, I'm responsible for 3,500 hectares of forest in this area with a great range of site types and sizes. And then in 2003, given the interest in CCF growing, in conjunction with Hugh Denman, Phil Morgan and Andy Paul, we set up Select 4 with the objective of delivering consultancy advice in the regular forestry training and also monitoring as well, which we might talk about as we go forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. So I will start with the first question that's been submitted. And the first one we have was from Ryan Knight Fox. Are there any sites that use CCF that are a broadleaf woodland that I'm able to visit? I'm located in Ceredigion in Wales. Are there any courses coming up regarding CCF and broadleaf woodlands? Well, I know I'm based in Wales. I know that Ruth Pybus and David do run courses in 100% broadleaf near Abergele in North Wales. So it might be worth going to their website broadleaf. Ruth Pybus is actually on here on the webinar, so you could direct message Ruth. That's in the Welsh context. But David, I know you've got experience with broadleaf and CCF.
Yes, Select 4 run courses in partnership. We've just started running them in partnership with the RFS, and they're being promoted on the RFS site as well as the Select 4 site. The first one being next spring, but we still plan to do 2 a year. And it is focused in the Wessex area, but it covers not just conifers, but broadleafs too. It's a 2-day course. And we do end up looking at some quite well-developed vertical structures in irregular broadleaf. But I know that doesn't help you if you want to look at stuff in Wales. But
Okay, thanks, David. So the next question we have is from David Shepherd, and I'm just going to see if David's on the call because he would actually like to ask his question in person. David, if you're on the call, would you like to unmute and fire away? No, maybe not. There is somebody called David, but I'm not sure if it's the David that's put the question. So I will.
Hello.
Oh, he's there. Hi,
I've
David.
succeeded. I've made the technology work. Thank goodness for that. My question is, bearing in mind the carbon emissions of clear fell, ground prep and planting, does CCF have better overall emission figures than clear fell? And if so, how might a shift to CCF be encouraged through financial incentives?
Okay. Maybe Andrew, if you'd like to say something on, have you got any questions on that? And with the carbon benefits of taking a continuous cover approach, and also around the policy side and financially supporting the carbon incentives of CCF.
Sure, I can give it a go. Yes, generally, as we're aware, in temperate forests, a lot of the carbon is locked up in the soils. In fact, in some temperate forests, there's more carbon in the soil than there is in the above ground biomass. So yes, anything which is basically reducing soil disturbance is likely to have a positive effect on carbon emissions. It's quite a nice bit of work which was done by Gary Kerr and Tor Stokes looking at the environmental benefits of CCF. And they reckon that, again, complex CCF systems are probably best in terms of conserving carbon. Then even simple systems, then rotational sort of even age management and that kind of order. Again, because of things like soil disturbance. Another aspect, though, there was quite an interesting study done recently in Sweden where they compared continuous cover forestry with clear fell systems, and they found actually that they were fairly similar. And actually, what was more important, so I think this is situation dependent as well. They found that what was more important was actually the growth rate of the tree species which are used, because faster growing trees suck up more in the way of carbon over time. And they also found that another really important element of comparison is where the produce actually goes. In other words, for example, how much of the product actually goes to, for example, long-term products rather than short-term products. But yeah, I think we can probably say that in general, there are carbon benefits basically for using complex CCF systems, and certainly there are in terms of reducing things like soil disturbance. Do you want me just to have a quick chat about incentives?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. That would be very helpful.
Is that okay? Yeah. So So I did some digging, and I don't think there are. I couldn't really find any, and I'm not the policy person. Okay, so someone else might chip in, but I couldn't find anything. There were no specific incentives for CCF, but there is the countryside stewardship grant for PAWS restoration, which involves thinning, etc. So that is a possibility, of course, only if you're on a PAWS site. And I think within the question you were asking about what could be done, if you want to have a look at what could be done, quite a good model is, you're probably aware that there's a lot of interest, policy interest in CCF in Europe. And Ireland still being in Europe, whichever, they've set up, they have a grant system which is actually focused on CCF. It has a 12-year time span, which strikes me as being sensible, given, you know, this take longer than sort of planting, etc. They pay about 750 euros per hectare at 3 points during a 12-year period. And if you have a look on the Irish website, they seem to fund pretty well anything, you know, which has to do with CCF. It seems to be a very flexible grant. So if you were asking about if there was a will, you know, a political will to move more towards CCF, I think probably the Irish model might be quite useful. So they've got this CCF grant, but they've also they are promoting forest sort of types, like our forest development types, and one of them is a conifer CCF one, and they're paying 5,421 euros, basically, excluding fencing, as a payment, and also annual payments, basically for 15 to 20 years, basically, to support that. So they must be putting a significant amount of money and resources into developing CCF in Ireland.
Wow, fantastic answer to the question, Andrew. David, does that satisfy your question, David?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
extremely helpful.
Oh, sorry.
The one thing I would ask is that grant system actually effective in Ireland? Are people taking it up? Is it having the desired effect?
It's a very good question. I don't know. I have a feeling that I don't know. I don't know. I mean, they're doing some. Ireland are doing some very interesting work on CCF. I mean, we're looking at developing guidance in the UK, and in Ireland they're hoping to get sort of general woodland owners involved more, and so they're looking to try and create as simple a system as possible. I was speaking with, I don't know if people come across Jonathan Spatsy, who's involved in it in Ireland. They're considering actually producing an app or something like that to make the sort of advice more accessible. So I would suggest, you know, if you're interested in sort of developments, etc., keep an eye on Ireland. They're doing some. They seem to be doing some quite interesting stuff at the moment.
Yeah, great. David Pengelly, do you have anything to add to the carbon situation with CCF?
Yeah, perhaps we all need to move to Ireland or the Irish Republic, because I know that Wiltshire, the state forestry there, are really behind CCF, and so are the one or two of the investment companies there. They really see the benefit of it. Yes, there are the obvious savings in emissions in irregular forestry, of course, which are basically not having to remove brushwood or handle brushwood. That's a massive saving. Because in irregular forests, or permanent irregular forests, or selection forests, if you like to call them that, you don't need to handle brushwood at all, and that's quite a cost, as well as actually quite a lot of emissions doing it and a loss of it breaking down. Also, well, you have got the replanting costs, and you've got less time when the ground is in effect fallow and not fully stocked. It's quite interesting, the agricultural sector, farmers are incentivized to do a winter cover crop, greening as they call it, to mitigate the runoff and try and reduce the runoff of sediment and loss of soil and everything. Perhaps that's something the government could look to support through some incentive in the UK. I think one of the other key points to think about in terms of possible greater opportunity for carbon capture in irregular stands, and again, I'm talking about permanent irregular stands, is the fact you have a better timber assortment for bigger timber, and also more timber going into construction and end uses where it's going to be locked up for longer periods of time if you're producing a lot more smaller size products. So I think that could be seen as a benefit, especially if you were switching from a clear fell system to a regular system. So there is actually a net gain. So that's another point that's probably worth noting.
Okay, great. Wow, really interesting stuff. And I will mention that Jonathan Spatsy is on the board for ProSilver Ireland, and obviously Continuous Cover Forestry Group is the UK membership organisation of the ProSilver European Network. So we do have meetings and events with ProSilver Ireland quite regularly. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. This is from David Henderson. David, are you on the call? Would you like to unmute and fire away? Hello, David.
There is a David, but I'm not quite certain if it's David Henderson or not.
No, okay, well, I will assume it's not. So I will ask the question. So his question submitted was, when managing a Scots pine site via group systems, is it the panel's expectation the site will have reached 2,500 stocking density by year 5 in most cases? So I think that's probably more appropriate for Hazel because she works specifically with pine in Scotland. So Hazel, would you like to have a go answering that?
Yeah, I think in most cases, I think it should, but you have to bear in mind that you've got to meet all the criteria for natural regeneration. You've got to have the right species on the right site, on the right soil. You've got to have the non-competing vegetation. And perhaps more crucially, it's browsing levels. If you're not getting natural regeneration, I would suggest trying to put in some exclusion plots to make sure it's not browsing that's holding back the natural regeneration. One of the other things that is obviously very crucial is enough light. So if you're working with Scots pine, I found that Scots pine, especially the further north you come in the UK, is very light sensitive. And sometimes the overstory has to be, more of the overstory has to be removed in order to get pine natural regeneration. If you're finding that you're getting more birch and sort of rowan regeneration, that means that you're nearly at the right basal area or the right light coming down to the forest floor, and it's just a few more trees removed will give you enough light to get Scots pine. But yeah, that's what I would say. But in 5 years, all things being equal, you should get your 2,000, probably get more, to be perfectly honest.
Fantastic, thanks Hazel. Andrew, do you have experience of different factors on Scots pine regeneration at all?
Not nearly as much as Hazel, obviously, but again, I think probably the ground vegetation is quite important. There has been work done on birch and pine, Scots pine regeneration, and there are certain types of ground vegetation which really inhibit Scots pine regeneration. Things which are positive are things like sparse bracken and heather. They found that actually was all right. And recently burnt and grazed areas. So I think you've also got to be thinking about the competition from vegetation. There's also another quite nice study which was done looking at colonization of pine from a woodland edge. And they found, so they put in a number of treatments, one of which was herbicide, which didn't actually have a great deal of effect. But what they also did is scarification. And scarification had a massive effect. So in addition to, I think, to what Hazel was saying, I think also you may need to be thinking about sort of some form of vegetation control and making sure that there's a relatively, that the seeds can access mineral soil, that you're providing a suitable seed bed.
I would agree with that. I think Scots pine, I think it does struggle a wee bit with bracken and deep heather. So if you've got rank heather underneath a Scots pine canopy, it can struggle. It needs the gaps. It's a pioneer species, so bare soil it absolutely loves. And you can get some very good regeneration just with some light disturbance. And look for mosses and finer grasses, a typical W18 understory does really well when you open it up. But if you've got heaps and heaps of bracken, probably do some bracken control before you remove the overstory would be the best plan.
So is a more sustainable way of doing that introducing, I know that Scotland have the woodland grazing toolbox. I'm not sure whether they talk about pine, but are we talking about big animals, cattle, timing of cattle, scarification, introducing cattle at the right time?
You can, some estates, sort of Darnaway estate have had reasonable success trying to use larger animals, herbivores for that. It depends on the scale of your CCF. I mean, you can even think about, if you're covering a large area, bringing in machines and being discreet with it. Sometimes you're harvesting, depending on your ground vegetation, can disturb it enough to give you pockets of bare ground or control some vegetation as well.
Great. Okay. I think we've pretty much covered that question, I think, on the Scots pine. There's a similar question on Scots pine and Corsican asked by Edward Brunn. Is Edward Brunn on the call? Would he like to? He is on the call. Edward, would you like to submit your question to the panel? Hello, Edward. Okay, he's not. It looks like he's muted on mine. I'll try and ask the question as best as I can. Okay. So he's introducing strips of clear cutting in P65 Scots Corsican pine. The strips are 25 to 30 meters wide. Oh, hang on. Is there somebody there?
I'm trying. Can you hear me?
Oh, hello. Yes, we can. Hello, Edward. Yeah, would you like to submit your question to the panel?
Yes, my question is, this is in North Norfolk. I'm introducing strips of clear cutting in P65 Scots and Corsican pine. Strips are 25 to 30 meters wide in the north-south orientation, being at right angles to the prevailing wind, starting at the eastern edges of various compartments. I'm going to restock by planting red oak, sweet chestnut, and Douglas. The red oak and sweet chestnut 1.5 by 1.5 meters, and the Douglas 2 by 2. These are going to be in small blocks, about a third each of each species, hoping to get some natural regeneration as well. The deer protection will be in the form of using trico to the planted trees, as the strips are of the size which are too small to economically deer fence. My question is, how long should I wait before either clear felling or heavily thinning the next strip, advancing in the westerly direction, so that after that, until the whole compartment is restocked?
Okay, thanks, Edward. I'm guessing that Hazel, this is relevant to your work, I assume.
Yeah, I've been using strip systems quite successfully. I was thinking that I've been leaving my strip systems for about 1.5 meters, 2 meters high, to make sure that they're well above any sort of deer browsing levels and have fully established before taking off the next 30-meter strip. However, I'm not entirely sure how much regeneration you're going to get. It seems to be a wee bit early for removal of the crown for Scots pine, and certainly Corsican. Scots pine's not producing lots of seed until it's about 70 years old, while your Scots pine's about just coming up for 60. And Corsican's even older. I think that's around the 80 to 90 years old, maybe even over 100 before it's producing lots of seed. You will get some, but it won't be to its maximum seed production. So your natural regeneration might be slightly slower than if you waited 10 years to do this. Everything else seems absolutely fine. The strip system seems to be in the right direction, and you want to go in the right way westwards. And maybe again, as I said earlier, exclusion plots just to see what your deer browsing actually is.
Okay.
There is some Douglas and larch in the wood as well. And I think there is already some regeneration happening of those species. I think we would see quite a bit of that as well as birch, of course.
Yeah, I think you probably get a predominance of Douglas and especially larch. Larch seeds quite much earlier than the other species.
So you think in about 5 years' time I could then do the next strip?
If your trees have reached about 1 metre high, I would wait that long to make sure that they're clear of all animal browsing efforts, and to make sure that you've got sufficient stuff. If on a first strip, you will continually recruit seeds into your strip, and it's to make sure that you've got sufficient seedlings in amongst what else you have planted there in amongst your Douglas and your oaks. Yeah.
I think that answers my question fairly well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you for your question. Okay, next question is from Ted Wilson. Ted's question: can the panel discuss the financial aspects of CCF, both in terms of active management and future research priorities? So let's talk about active management first, on the financial aspects of CCF. David, I think maybe we'll ask you on the active management of the financial aspects of CCF.
Okay, well, the aim in your selection forest or your regular forest is to try and fill your stand with fast-growing, high-value trees and harvesting those individual trees when they've reached their optimum financial value or their maximum increment value. So in terms of producing the value in your stand, it's quite achievable. I mean, in terms of the volume, in terms of harvesting, it's often a big question. Of course, if you're going to clear fell, at the end point when you're felling, your harvesting costs will be down because of the amount of volume. But the interim thinnings, where your piece size is a bit smaller and your overall volume per hectare coming out in your low thinnings isn't that high. Whereas in the irregular structures, the harvesting of a regular amount, a larger amount, we're felling the same volume of timber over the same period of time, if you look at, say, a long period of 80 to 100 years. But the average piece size you're removing is bigger. And we know from experience that harvesting bigger stems actually is cheaper than smaller ones. I think that, yeah, of course, we got the benefits if you got the right species seeding into your stand of the right provenance, then you can establish your next generation trees using natural regeneration as far as possible, with some enrichment planting if you want to. So you reduce your establishment costs, because if you're growing trees, big trees, for example, Douglas fir on productive sites to very large dimensions, up to 90 centimeter DBH, you've got quite a long passage of time. So you're only going to need something like 125 stems per hectare when they're at size 10 centimeter diameter. And if you've got a crop where you're a species which you want to have a shorter passage of time, like spruce, because obviously there's no benefit in keeping them big because you've reached the optimum financial value a lot earlier. So if you're growing them to say 55 as a target size to grow to 55 centimeter, you've got a shorter passage of time, but you still would only in that scenario need maybe 250 stems per hectare at 10 centimeters diameter. The other big cost saving is, of course, not handling the brash, which I mentioned earlier. We know the cost of handling brash after clear fell is quite large. You completely mitigate that. There's no need to touch brushwood at all, plus it's recycled completely in a regular structure. So there are some, I would say that there are, I think it needs to be recognized that if you're going to transform an even age plantation to a regular, you need to recognize that there will be a point where you reduce the growing stocks to initiate regeneration. So if you're generally following conventional thinning, say up to late 20s, and then you wanted to go into what we might refer to as the regen initiation phase, you have to drop the basal area or the growing stocks, and to initiate the regeneration, whether that's planting or natural regen. So during that phase, you're going to have a lower stand increment, even if your individual trees are growing fast. But this is really an issue with transformation, but once you've fully transformed the stand, there's no reason why it shouldn't be producing the same volume over the same period of time as even aged. But it's just, but I think the other things you have to recognize is you could deliver your objectives maybe by clear felling, but is it really sustainable and resilient in the face of climate change we've got coming and all the pathogens and extreme weather events we're getting with it? I think that the massive benefits of going irregular in terms of economics as well, because things have got to be economically sustainable as well as biologically, is actually having a stand that can be resilient in the face of these pathogens and absorb shocks through restocking, taking out disease stuff and restocking during your regular visits to the forest, where you harvest lower quality first disease stuff and then restock. So just a few points there.
Okay. Can I just ask something on measurement, David? Because a point that comes up at field meetings is about the need to measure. And we went on a study tour. The CCFG went on a study tour to Belgium, to Wallonie in September, and we saw some very productive oak stands on very fertile lowland sites. But it was clear the amount of measurements that they were doing to be able to understand this concept of equilibrium. I mean, these are mixed woodlands. They're primarily target species is oak, but they had a very good idea of target basal areas. And I think this concept in France and Belgium and Germany, I think they understand target basal areas a lot better than we do in an irregular system. But on measurement, you know, how much is measurement a part of your management, and what type of measurement do you do down on your sites down at Stourhead?
Well, that's a really pertinent question, and I was hoping that would come up and thought I might be able to touch on it with Tom Andre's question. But having raised it, Johnny, I mean, it's actually vital we know what's going on in our stands, to know how these stands are performing in the light of current climate that's being thrown at them, and also the sites that they're on. And because we're basically moving away from a system of, we're replacing rotation length with target diameter, i.e. when the trees reach its optimum financial value, depending on its species and site type and what have you. And we're moving away from an age and area based forecasting to looking at increment basically, and we want increment data on diameter increment, basal area and volume. And the way to do it is set up a sample maybe of permanent sample plots in a sample of your stands where they're mostly developed and there's perhaps more complex and there's more going on. And then that gives you a benchmark of what you've got in the forest and what's there, and it'll give you your stem size, stem frequency distribution, your basal area distribution, and your volume distribution, and your species, and that gives you a benchmark on your stocking, basal area, and volume. But you can't then wait. What I mean is you're desperate then for your second measure, because that then gives you real, true increment data on all these aspects, and it tells you exactly what's going on in your forest. And we use that information, then we learn from that, and we apply what we learn from there in terms of stocking levels, distribution of, we've got targets, we set targets for where we're trying to achieve with a different mixture of stands, whether it's evergreen conifer dominated or got broadleaf in it, we'll have a target where we're trying to get to in terms of basal area and volume, showing it in a chart. And that'll be our target. And then you use this real site data to inform you what's going on, and it gives you incredible information. Every time we do this, we get information on what the stand's doing, which you wouldn't get by walking through the forest. Such as we had I better not go on actually, but it's really key to have that information. And we could talk more about it on another question if you like.
Okay, thanks, David. Great. What about future research priorities on the financial aspects of CCF? Maybe, well, Andrew, because obviously Andrew works for Forest Research. So Andrew, can you say anything on financial aspects and future research of CCF?
Yeah, sure. No, I thought David's answer was very good. He's got, I think, with risk reduction being a major thing, you know, again, in turn, a major factor for moving towards a regular multi-species stands. So yeah, research priorities. One of them actually leads on very nicely from David's last point, is actually finding efficient ways of measuring complex stands, because again, what we've got is we've got a range of different species at a range of different ages. Again, I think we're all familiar with the Blue Book, which is relatively straightforward. This is much more complicated, and so, you know, at the moment we're doing it manually, often through plots, but perhaps in the future we may be using things like remote sensing, might be using crown diameters as a measure for stem diameters and things like that. So I think actually that's something which could be interesting from a research point of view. I'm part of a team that does wood properties research. Again, we don't fully understand the sort of effects of different systems basically on the wood properties of trees. There's I think there's a question later on about wood properties, so I won't go on too much. We've also not got yield models. So when someone asks us, you know, what kind of money is this going to make us, it's very difficult to tell them because again, the yield models that we're used to are even age monocultural yield models. They're fairly straightforward. Again, they're on a sort of area basis, as David said. They're not on a per tree basis. So we need to that. Once we've got yield models that work, we need to look at timber quality models, which are related to those yield models. Okay, so there's quite a lot you can see that we could do. So that's kind of at the stand level. I think it would be very interesting, and I know that some of my economics colleagues are hoping to look at this, is look at the economic differences between different silvicultural systems. Again, this will be very site specific, but perhaps by making some assumptions, they may be able to make some comparisons. And then actually, if we think about resilience, we're not just thinking at the stand level, we're also thinking about at the landscape level. And perhaps what we might want actually is a range of different silvicultural systems across landscapes. Again, we might have clear fell still up on the exposed tops. We might have short rotation forestry on agricultural land. We might have continuous cover forestry in the other bits. Is actually understanding how a sort of mosaic of potentially different systems might also bring resilience to our forests at a sort of landscape level. So I think there is lots that we don't know about continuous cover forestry. So there's lots of fertile ground for research. We just need the money.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, next question. This is a question submitted by Harry Wilson. And Harry's asked me if I will ask this question. So he asks, where is natural regeneration not appropriate, i.e. it won't work? UK forestry standards suggest that natural regeneration or low impact silvicultural systems lists should be applied to most Scottish forestry. But he's asking, where is natural regeneration not appropriate and it won't work? So obviously this is applied to Scottish forestry. So I think Hazel, would you like to say anything on that?
Yeah, I think it's primarily the areas that may not be the most appropriate is on steep and inaccessible slopes, when the basis of continuous cover is getting into thin early. And if you can't access those woods to do that, or they're scattered and therefore very uneconomical to do, then I think you'll struggle from there on. And against also in Scotland, we do have this higher density all over the UK, higher density of deer populations. So your browsing pressure is crucial to getting that. And if that is not under control, then you'll not get natural regeneration. Either too thin, never mind actually do anything else with it. So I think there are physical limitations on the landscape that may prevent it being absolutely everywhere.
Okay, thanks, Hazel. That's a pretty comprehensive answer, I think. Unless Andrew or David, have you got anything to add to that?
That's fine.
Yes, I could perhaps just add, sorry, David, are you wanting to?
No, that's fine, Andrew.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's quite, it's picking up from what Hazel said before, the sort of four important factors determining natural regeneration: seed supply, conditions suited to germination, conditions suited to seedling growth once you've got germination, and then protection. There was some rather nice work done by Gary Kerr and Tor Stokes on prediction of conifer natural regeneration, a sort of system where you would go out and you would look at coning, whether there was a lot of seed, and then you would look at the conditions suited to germination. You would look at whether the soil was fertile or not, because on fertile it's more difficult. And various other aspects, and there is in fact a form and a checklist, I think, which is associated with that. And I would suggest that that might also, if you were trying to work out whether you're going to be successful in obtaining natural regeneration, that's quite a good systematic sort of system for appraising a site in terms of it. Do you have advanced regeneration, on the edges and things like that? All of these can give you a very good indication as to whether you're going to be successful in getting natural regeneration.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. So this question has been submitted by Tom Andre, and I'll ask Tom, if he's on the call, to unmute and ask his question to the panel.
Hi, thank you. It's been touched on slightly by David, but the importance of knowing your stands well is obviously really clear. I'm interested in how foresters on the panel essentially manage their inventory and know what's happening in their woods well enough to make these really complex decisions. I work for Forestry England, and we work at big scales, and we're all for lists, but it's really complicated, obviously, and we're trying to get our heads around quite how we do the recording for different list systems. So yeah, any thoughts from the private sector and from research, really appreciated.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, David did quite expand on, he'd go into some detail on inventory. Is there anything, David, you did want to add on what you said earlier on inventory work?
I suppose it's just worth making the distinction between what I've touched on just now as being stand management information, which we need to know what the performance is, what's happening, which is giving a snapshot, etc. But I think the other thing is inventories. Obviously, in inventory, you're looking at information from the whole forest area, and that requires putting in more plots throughout. But I suppose I would advocate, rather than doing one-off inventories, perhaps pre-harvest and things like that, is putting in permanent sample plots, which they can give you that same information, but also you've got them in permanently, so you can do repeated measurements on the same plots over periods of time, because that will give you some real data on what's going on. But of course, doing that over a whole forest estate at the right intensity would be quite expensive. But you could start off doing them in some of your key stands, because the first thing you're going to do when you look at your forest area, you're going to stratify it. If you feel you can and want to deliver your objectives of management by applying the principles of irregular forestry, you need to look at your forest. There's going to be some areas which aren't suitable to do a conversion or transformation to irregular on that current generation of trees. So you might have some fairly mature Sitka or what have you, and you haven't got time to transform it. So your option there is either clear fell or do a shelterwood over a period of time, bring in some other species, and you've got a bit more differentiation and regeneration, say doing a shelterwood over 20-30 years to then go into permanently irregular on the next generation of trees. You're going to have some area, you're going to have different systems. So you're not going to be going straight into permanently irregular on all your stands in your under your sort of remit. So you stratify your forest, and then I would say get some permanent sample plots in. And best, I really recommend the irregular silvicultural network protocols of putting in plots. And it collects this basic data we talked about, this increment data on your diameter and what all the frequency distribution over the size classes. And then when you do your next measure, gives you that real increment data on all these aspects, which is brilliant. And you can then just use that to learn from that what's going on in your stand. So, I mean, Phil Morgan did write an article about the ISN, the Irregular Silvicultural Network Protocols, for the CCFG in 2017, and again an update in 2021. So I'm sure you could get those from the CCFG site or from Jonny. And the beauty of it, it's not directing you what to do, it's really just chronicling what you're doing, and you learn from that. But the beauty of a common system is that it can be put together with other people's records for similar site types with similar species, and you can just look at what's going on. It's very, very informative. And it's a cut down version of what they're doing on the continent through the AFI, the Association of Forestry Regular, or the High Forest Regular or High Forest Club. It's a cut down, more simple version in English, which is being promoted quite widespread now in the UK and in the Irish Republic. So I would recommend looking at that, and we can send you information about it if you need to.
Okay, thanks, David. And I think it's also worth mentioning the forest development types. I find the forest development types that Jens Haufer developed, I found very helpful in providing a vision for woodland managers, woodland owners, in what's possible in mixtures in different settings. I think the forest development types are very, very useful to visualize and have a trajectory to work towards. But I think this concept of basal areas, I think spending time in Europe, I've seen how it's a key concept to understand with mixtures, is understanding your target basal areas. I mean, I don't know whether maybe Andrew or Hazel, I mean, in terms of target basal areas, can you give any figures for any species? Just, maybe just, have you got any ideas of what target basal areas you work for particular species, whether it's pine or spruce?
There's I can't remember off the top of my head, but there has been work done by Sophie Hale on conifer species, looking at everything from larch, Scots pine, Douglas fir, and western hemlock. So what she has done is she has related again crown density and regeneration to basal areas. So I think if I remember rightly, sort of things like Scots pine, maybe 25, something along those lines. Does that make sense? Going up to sort of almost double that for western hemlock, not perhaps surprisingly. I mean, the only problem with using that is it probably works best, doesn't it, when you're looking at a uniform system, where you have a uniform cover, of a certain basal area. What you've also got to consider, is if you are using a system where you've got gaps, is gap sizes and gap orientation, because that's going to affect also the amount of light and you will also get different amounts of light at different parts of that gap, as the sun goes across the day. Yeah, but I think these basal areas, and then basal areas for broadleaves are much less. So I think they are definitely useful, and I think as David was saying, really when we're looking at inventory, we're looking at basal area, we're looking at of irregular stands, basal area, we're looking at target diameters, which I think David also has mentioned, different species, and we're looking at the Q factor, the shape basically yes, of that diameter distribution. So we need a system basically which an inventory system which captures that. And the difficulty is that we are dealing with very complicated structurally and species-wise systems. That means that you actually need to do a lot more sampling and things like that than you would do for an even-aged monoculture. So yeah, there are a number of potential systems. So there's the one that David mentioned, which is the AFI, Irregular Silvicultural Network one. There is Forestry Commission Information Note 45, which was developed by Gary Kerr. That's another way of monitoring sort of stands in terms of BDQ. And then there's also a Belgian, you might have seen it actually, a Belgian and French one, which a Belgian and French method, which involves reloscope sweeps and permanent plots, which also looks quite interesting. So there's a range of approaches. Jonathan Spatsy, again, his name seems to be coming up, has done quite a nice comparison of those three systems, and that's available online if you want to have a look in terms of precision and cost, really. So,
Jonny, I can
Great.
add to that.
Yes, go on, David.
But just picking up on Andrew's point about basal area distribution, of course, yes, you know, in a stand of a reasonable size, you want to do your basal area assessments right through it and then look at the average. But it is, depending on your target species mixture you're going for, it can be very valuable to have a big variation in your stocking within your stand you're taking to permanently irregular, so you can accommodate the different light requiring species requirements in that stand. So, you know, we might have a 75% evergreen conifer dominated stand, but then 25% light demand, including broadleaf. So we want to have niches for all species through the stand. So the basal area might range from 15 to 40 across a 50 hectare area. But actually the requirements of each species is different, but you can accommodate it. And again, as Andrew said, obviously the more light demanding the species is, the higher the growing stocks you can have in your regular structure. And the more light, and it's very directly related to efficiency of crown as well. It's quite interesting. So species like Douglas fir are fairly typical in terms of crown efficiency to the silver fir on the continent. They're pretty efficient, and so is spruce. But then we've got the other end of the spectrum, so you can have slightly higher growing stocks in your regular structure. And also the height of the box. So of course, if you've got Douglas and fir that grow really tall, the box is really high. Whereas if you've just got broadleaves and are very light demanding, the box is shorter and you need a far lower growing stock. So your basal area requirements for oak, for example, which they demonstrated on the continent, are going to be more like 16 to 20 or oscillating very, very low in the high teens. Whereas Douglas fir, spruce are going to be more in oscillating between probably 36 down to 30, fir and hemlock a bit higher. So, but depending what your target is and the mixes you want, you can adapt that and make sure you've got that variability within the stocking and the stand.
Great. I mean, I have got to ask Hazel on the pine. Do you say with that, Hazel, is that familiar to you, that figure? I think Andrew said around about 25 meters, square meters a hectare. Is that about the sort of basal area you expect with the pine stands you work at?
Yeah, I found I needed it a wee bit lower, just being that wee bit further north. We did do some thinning right down to sort of 25, 26, 24. And it was so sensitive that where we didn't have it low enough, we got nothing. And we didn't even get birch. We got very little. And I think that was purely looking back on it now, I think that was a limiting factor, that we just were not getting enough light through. We were trying to go for a shelter wood system, and this far north with the angle of the sun, and especially over the winter, we just weren't getting enough light down to the ground level. Some of the group systems that I've been working with are more oval shaped, just to try and maximise both the direct light into the ground and the lateral light down to the forest floor. And yeah, I think it's to be taken a bit like the Blue Book. You often think that the Blue Book is measured in a field of telegraph poles, but you've actually got to be very site specific. So you've got to be quite honest with yourself and how many of those telegraph poles you're growing. So if your site is much further north, then you might have to go lower. If you're in the south of England, you might have the opposite. You might be able to hold slightly higher basal areas. Yeah,
and also the soil type that you're working on as well, of course, is a major factor, isn't it? Thanks, Hazel. So next question is by Tom Haynes. Tom's asked if I can ask the question. So Tom asks, which improvements to timber quality from CCF are most likely to be realised in the form of higher values being paid for the timber? i.e. if there's a positive effect on timber stiffness and density that leads to higher strength grades, how can the woodland owner capitalize on this? So I know, David, you're involved with timber marketing, I believe. So would you like to say something on, timber improvements in the timber quality and higher strength grades from thinnings from CCF managed stands?
Yes, okay. Just to say, there was quite an interesting PhD research article done by, I think it was Bath University in 2012, where they looked at the stiffness and strength of, in particular, Douglas fir, and it was, and they were looking at the juvenile wood and the mature wood, and sort of pointing out the reasons why the juvenile wood is weak. It's all to do with the development of the crown and the hormones which are going on, and demonstrated that the smaller you can keep that juvenile wood, the better, because that's the weak wood, and the rest of it is going to be the strong wood. And talked about the potentially there are sort of implications for silvicultural systems. So if you've got a system where it actually slows the growth of your tree without compromising its potential for the future, if it slows the growth of the tree in the early parts of its development, it reduces the core of juvenile wood. And they even said it's not directly related to the number of years. It's quite interesting. So if you've got a system such as, I might say, permanently irregular Douglas, you think about your reverse J curve in terms of your distribution of stems in your structure, where you've got the greatest number of small stems and the least number of big ones. Your small stems, which are your natural regeneration and then saplings, even before they get to sort of small poles, are sitting there in lower light and not growing at optimum rate. If they were in a replanted clear fell site, they'd be growing really fast right from the beginning until they close canopy. So in effect, they did discuss this in the paper, by having the slow growth, because they're in the sort of shadow of the dominance in an irregular structure, they're growing slowly. And then as long as you're not compromising their potential to go fast once you release them or they get up into the vertical structure, then that can actually result in a greater proportion of strong wood. The other thing just to say is, I'll just touch on, of course, in clear fell replant, you're relying on lateral competition to create fine branching. But of course, in the selection forest, you're relying on diffuse light. So again, it's maintaining the growing stocks at the right level to make sure it's sustainably regenerating, but also using that light which is your control to create fine branching in your young trees. I think I'd just say that we've just been supplying an order of Douglas fir for somebody who is got a high spec cladding requirement, and their spec was no more than 2 annual rings per centimetre, so 5 per inch, without any consideration of whether it's juvenile wood or mature wood. But I was talking to them about this and sent them this paper actually, because I said they need to look at it. But it was quite interesting, and it was actually being very, very high cost. So the other thing just to say, of course, is that you're not going to optimize your Douglas. Basically, the greater the proportion of mature wood in your stem, then obviously the stronger it will be as an overall piece. So growing large dimension timber is definitely a benefit, because you've got a very, very small core of juvenile wood in the centre. And of course, with some of that material, it's not reaching its maximum price to the top of the price size curve until it's up to 90 centimetres to work.
And I think a lot of it's to do with the microfibril angle, isn't it? I know that Dan Ridley Ellis at Napier University looked at this specifically. It's very interesting looking at some of the strength grading tests he does. I've got into some interesting conversations on silviculture with him, because I think they recognise that silviculture is something that needs to be looked at with it. I did send a message. It's such an interesting question. I sent it to Dujan Rojan Bagar. He's the assistant professor of silviculture at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, to find out if he knew anything on studies related to this. And he replied and said, as I can tell from what I've seen in the field and my communication with wood processing people, so that's in Slovenia, high quality of saw logs can be a result of a selection silviculture due to low light level environment in the younger phases of tree growth, which results in longer branch free part of the log. Due to slow growth of trees, this is the case for conifers, so Norway spruce and silver fir, their central parts are of higher wood density, which makes them more rot resistant and of better technical properties, also increased statical stability. However, after release, the growth level increases and the wood inside the log becomes less homogeneous, which is considered bad for the wood processing people, which is basically what you've just said, isn't it, David?
Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew, have you got anything on forest research that you want to say on this topic?
No, I think that's been covered very nicely. I think, yeah, the big benefit, I think, is big trees means that you've got a very small proportion of juvenile wood, you know. I'm just going to put in the chat, there's quite a nice paper report which was done by Barry Gardner and Elspeth MacDonald, yeah, on this, and they've got quite a nice table at the back which actually looks at, you know, all the benefits from large trees, the wood product. Then the problems if you have gaps, because that's a negative actually, you know, because it creates branching on one side and things like that. They also talk about things like gaps also, because trees are phototropic, you know, they bend towards gaps, so you might get less straight trees, round gaps and things like that. So they've got a very nice table in there, and also a discussion basically of the implications of adopting CCF on timber quality. But the main ones, I think, actually we've already kind of talked about.
That paper by Elspeth is absolutely fantastic. I know that paper. That's got some really interesting information, again, on the microfibril angle, etc. I'll post a couple of papers that Dujan has sent me on a study from Arkansas on Scots pine in North America, and another study in Germany. I'll post those in the chat. Okay, we'll go on to another question. This is a question by Solange, our treasurer at CCFG. Solange is asking, well, Solange, do you want to unmute? Do you want to ask the question? Hello, Solange, are you there?
I think she said, would you read it, Jonny?
Okay, yeah, that's fine, no problem. Okay, so the question is about using CCF to assist to increase resilience of the forest capital. So I'd like to know, non-host species for bark beetle would you recommend? Yeah, so using CCF to assist increase resilience of the forest capital. She'd like to know which non-host species for the bark beetle would you recommend? So obviously this is very relevant to us with the Ips beetle and the derogation on planting Sitka in the south because of Ips. So Solange is asking about resilience, forest resilience, using CCF to increase resilience, and, you know, particularly in spruce stands, what you would recommend non-host species for the bark beetle. Maybe Andrew, would you like to answer that?
Yes, yeah, sure. So actually we're going through a process at the moment of looking at species lists for different countries. I think the Welsh one has already been published. There was one a study done, it was done through Bangor University. So I think that is publicly available. England has been working on one, and Scotland have been working on as well. We've been putting quite a lot of input into the Scottish one, which is quite interesting. So it looks at things like, I think it's going to be a really nice piece of work, because it looks at things like timber markets. So it's looking at productive species. Okay, so it's looking at things like timber markets, but they've also got the experts together on pests and diseases, and then they've had us talking about silviculture. and things like, for example, the length of time taken to establish. So silver firs take longer than other things, you know, this kind of thing. They're going through a sort of consultative process to come up with a kind of list. And the idea basically is to try and have a productive conifer and broadleaf list, which will give alternatives to Sitka spruce, given there's this big concern, and Norway spruce, given that there's this big concern about IPS. So I think that should be, you know, that should be available fairly soon. I don't think there are going to be many surprises, so you could probably, you know, generally the focus will be on those species which are well tried and tested. Another consideration which I think is important, I personally think is important, is actually you probably want to be able to have a range of species across a range of genera. Okay, because again, to bring in additional sort of resilience. But I think, you know, if we're looking at sort of alternatives to Sitka, the other thing I was going to say is if you are interested in looking at alternatives to Sitka and you're looking at growth rates and things, there was a very nice bit of work done by Tor Stokes and Gary Kerr. Again, some familiar names. And they basically looked at stands of Sitka spruce and stands of other conifers close by, and they then came up with those species across different site types which had similar growth rates, basically, to Sitka spruce. So I don't have a link for that, but if you Google it, I think you'll be able to find it. So again, you know, there are Douglas fir, Western hemlock, Western red cedar. You know, they're the sort of normal sort of ones that you might kind of expect, basically.
You think birch? You know, I saw the strength grading that for birch that Dan Ridley Ellis did. It was quite incredible. Do you think birch will be a species that we're looking to, you know, commercialize in the future? Do you think?
I think it has. I personally, so this is my personal view. I think it has a lot of potential. Yeah, and I mean, if you go to IKEA, guess what most of the stuff is made of?
Yeah.
You know, so it is slower growing by volume terms, but then it's a lot denser. So if you think about in terms of biomass, you know, it may not be too far off. It's massively. I've also, I mean, I've always thought it might be something really good for low input, low output systems too. So having, you know, been to places like the Birkelands in Nottinghamshire, Birkelands, you just see it comes up, you know, it just comes up basically. They were lucky enough to get someone to thin it for them for racehorse hurdles, so even got paid to do all the respacing and things like that. Yeah, great. So I think birch, yeah, definitely birch. You know, birch has a role. If you're planting it, there is birch improved material now from the Future Trees Trust available. So yeah, no, I think birch definitely is a sort of moderately fast growing broadleaf. Environmentally it's brilliant too, you know, soil improver, you know, biodiversity, important for biodiversity. Yeah, definitely birch. I suspect birch might be on some of these lists.
Great. Okay, thanks, Andrew. Move on to the next question.
Jonny, I got something I could add there.
Oh, sorry, David. Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to start off by saying, in the last 10 years, we've had 21 new pests and diseases in the UK, and we've only got 6 conifer species making up 89% of the UK. So it's quite shocking. And also, with IPS in the southeast, how confident are you that it's not going to get out and spread? So I think there's an incredible threat and risk there, and it's so. And it just reminds us how important it is we have to build resilience in the forests, and we have to facilitate adaptation and mitigation. But I think in terms of irregular structures, for them to be sustainable, you have to intervene on a regular basis and cut the increment, or the whole system's compromised. And by getting in there and assessing the stands and having the freedom in those structures to remove any sign of any disease is really important. So, you know, we got stands with disease in and dendroctus, etc. And you're free to just remove large trees anyway, which are of low low quality, target those, and anything that's looking like it's lacking vitality or got some health impact, you remove them. And I think, yeah, you have to go mixed species, in my view, at the stand level to actually really facilitate adaptation and mitigation of these problems going forward.
Great, thanks. Hazel, do you have anything to add on resilience of CCF and using new species to improve resilience to pests and diseases up in Scotland, or anything to add to what Andrew and David have said?
Yeah, we're kind of going through that with the loss of larch, especially in the northeast of Scotland, which it was a very prominent species. And there isn't anything that's obvious to take over that. So we're having to use what we have in our toolbox to get species to grow. But I think it's really important, a huge benefit of CCF is having a lot of species in the one area, so that even if IPS, heaven forbid, does escape and comes through, you're not going to lose whole stands. You might lose a percentage of your stand, but not a whole stand. And it also gives the opportunity that there might be vectors in there that help control these species that do affect trees. So that if you're have everything all the same, then there's no chance for something else to come in and predate, say, IPS or something like that. You've got a multitude of habitats working on a multitude of species. And I think it's a much more connected system for doing that.
Great, thanks. Okay, move on to another question, and then we'll have questions from, well, that have been submitted in the chat. Okay, there's a question here from Roy Mosley, and he's asking, what are the potential benefits and pitfalls of a CCF approach to PAWS restoration? Hazel, do you have any thoughts on using CCF in PAWS restoration?
I think it depends on a site-to-site basis. I mean, it's not overly clear from the question exactly what type of PAWS registration. I mean, if you have PAWS and you have absolutely no remnant species, then you're going to be struggling to get that to naturally regenerate. If you've got some, but you're battling against a species such as Western hemlock or Sitka spruce, which can grow in very low light levels, then yes, you can naturally regenerate from your seed source, but you're going to have to work really hard to control the species coming in to remove, because they'll naturally regenerate as well. So I think it's very site specific. From that, I think it's possible to do, because you're obviously using a seed source so readily acclimatized to that site, and they'll obviously grow well, but you've got to battle against what you have there as the species that you're now removing. And it might not all be happening all at once. You might have to do it as a gradual thing rather than a whole scale.
Right, Andrew, anything to say on CCF and PAWS?
Yeah, I think it's quite suited to a number of applications of PAWS. First of all, you're maintaining a forest microclimate. So things like mycorrhazae, all the soil organisms, those remnants, if there are any of the original ancient semi-natural woodland, are more likely to be maintained, I think, in a woodland sort of microclimate, rather than, again, removal. So I think there's some very good sort of environmental sort of ecological reasons. You could perhaps use the canopy to control weed competition, etc., rather than things like herbicides. Also, there's the possibility of maintaining an income, using the conifer overstory, retaining it a bit longer to provide some form of income, actually, over time. But I absolutely, one of the big problems which Hazel has picked up on is obviously you are providing a seed source of conifers when you probably don't want conifers. So it's going, there's likely to be a degree, isn't there, of unwanted conifer regeneration. Actually, I think that is probably the major negative.
Yeah, I've just posted the Woodland Trust in the modules for PAWS restoration. You can download their 5 modules, but what drove the Woodland Trust approach was the Curtis and Brown paper from Oxford. I've posted a link to that, and that compared clear felling and restoring ancient woodland sites by clear felling and restocking, and they measured the response of the understory, and they found that a gradual transformation resulted in a less dramatic loss of remnant plant species. So that's what you know. Those modules by the Woodland Trust are on the website. David, have you used CCF on PAWS restoration effectively down at Stourhead?
Well, not at Stourhead, but on some other sites. Yeah, I mean, I endorse what's been said, but and again, to give another example in this part of the world, there might well be Western hemlock, for example, on a PAWS site, and we know that Western hemlock can be quite invasive in that it seeds quite early. It has a small seed, and it will set seed in a very, very low light. So they are one to watch. So the way to manage invasive conifers in a PAWS wood where you're restoring is probably keep those stands tight so that they aren't able to seed so much, because you find if we thin them, they'll just fill up with hemlock regeneration instead of what you're trying to restore. So I think it is, but I you know, other species, other conifers, you can work with them, and I think it is, yeah, it's a great asset to a gradual restoration of a PAWS site. And you know, is it the end of the world if you've got 5% conifer left on a PAWS site, especially if you've got a range of big trees which are delivering habitats for raptors to nest in and things like that? I think it's just, yeah, I think overall, yeah, I'll leave it at that because I could go on there.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. So we've got some questions in the chat here. So Thomas Cowley, would you like to read your question to the panel, Thomas?
Hello, have I got myself off mute? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
That's a relief. Okay, so I'm a trustee of a small woodland owning charity. We have a clear fell license for 3 hectares of PAWS on the Isle of Wight. It's the second half of a 6 hectare block. First half was felled and replanted with native species about 30 years ago. The new candidate block has a mix of conifer and ash with some ancient oak standards, naturally regenerating hazel and field maple and thorn in amongst the understory. We're quite unusual in the UK that we don't have any deer, which is a blessing for this. We have the license for clear felling. We'd like to use continuous cover principles in this second mature block. So are there any issues with us doing this with the Forestry Commission clear fell license that we have? And what would your high level guidance be for moving into this management process for us? And also, what cost will it be for the charity to join CCFG, please?
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Well, on the cost of joining, Polly can maybe send you a link. I think it's £50 for an organisation to join, but I'll get Polly to message you on that. On the question with Ancient Woodland, I think your question is about adopting CCF. You've had a clear fell licence, but you'd like to maybe not enact clear fell, but maybe use CCF. Is that right?
That's right. There's quite an interesting mix of remains of ancient woodland in amongst the plantation, which we'd like to capitalise on.
Well, I mean, in terms of UKFS, I can't see there being a problem at all with, you know, not proceeding with clear fell and adopting a CCF management approach. I think that would be seen quite wisely in terms of UKFS. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
Yes, yeah, I agree. Yes, I'm afraid I don't understand the bureaucracy, you know what I mean, behind that. So I don't know what kind of restrictions there are. The sort of, I suppose, the legal restrictions rather than the UKFS guidance. So I think probably Tom will need to talk to, it would be wise just to talk to the local woodland officer and just find out what the deal is.
Yeah, and the restocking liability will be different because you're moving from a clear fell restock to thinning, aren't you, ultimately? David, have you got anything to say on that, David? Or?
Yeah, I'd have to check, but I think that the maximum you can clear fell or fell in a 5-year period in nature woodland site is maybe 10% or something every 5 years, but that would need checking. But I think if you've got good justification or explanation and demonstration of why you want to do more than that at a faster pace, it's not, you know, I'm sure that we have that accepted. In terms of moving from clear fell to how you present it in another felling license, I would something like that. You maybe put in 80% of your woodland area for thinning, 20% for selective felling, and then that 20% selective felling enable you, without identifying where, but that will enable you to do a sort of a bit more of a group selection approach. So you can actually do some restoration, create a few, make it a bit more gappy than you would perhaps in a where you've got. So if you were going to bring back in shade-bearing species that if you're restoring, you probably want to promote the light demanders and bring in some more light demanding broadleaf. So you want it a bit more gappy, so you can actually plant in the gaps unless you are wholly using natural regen, in which case you still need the light. So then phase it over 50 years or 40 years rather than trying to do it in 5 or something.
Okay, great. I haven't got a lot of time, so we've got a couple more questions we'll squeeze in here. So Ian Hanna asks about, have any animal strategies been tested for ground cover management? We touched on that earlier with the pine in Scotland. Primitive cattle or pigs, maybe using mob grazing, buzz collars to control, measure fencing grazing areas. Are there any benefits to ground cover? Are there other benefits like soil disturb? Maybe Hazel, have you got anything to say on animal strategies, or maybe Andrew, do you have anything to say on that?
I haven't had any direct experience myself, though I know experiences where pigs have been used as wild boar, but they have to be moved quite regularly, otherwise there's no ground vegetation left whatsoever. And also there's an enhancement of the soil fertility, for want of a polite way of putting it, that happens in that area. I know of areas that are trying cattle with the electric collars, but I don't know of any published results on that. It sounds a good idea, and it sounds like a lightweight method, a light touch of controlling ground vegetation in a combination with giving some seed bed. But beyond that, I don't really have that. And soil conservation, I think good harvesting management should help with soil conservation as well. So it's not purely a CCF thing. As much as it would be really nice to wheek in a helicopter and cut the tree off at the base and there's nothing left, that isn't going to happen. You are going to have heavy machinery coming into the wood. So as forest managers, it's up to us to manage that, to minimise it and take sensible decisions in poor weather conditions, on site conditions, to minimise soil degradation.
Okay. And also you've got the woodland grazing toolbox, which is available online. That's very useful. Ian also asks, is soil conservation listed as a primary benefit from soil testing forest where CCF is more mainstream? Do you know anything about research and linking CCF to soil conservation? Maybe Andrew, do you know much about that, soil conservation and CCF?
No, not really. There's some work being done at the moment, although I've not had sight of it, on soil disturbance and carbon, but it's more towards cultivation, different cultivation methods, of more traditional forestry. Just on the woodland grazing stuff, they are doing some quite interesting work, the RSPB at Geltsdale, where they are using cattle basically and their ideas, again, these are bulk grazers, they're providing in different kind of the disturbance is varied across the site, and so they're hoping that they'll have a varied range of regeneration, that'll create heterogeneity, and they are using those buzz collars because they were saying that basically if up till now it's been very, very expensive because you need to have someone tending the cattle on a very, very regular basis. They've now got, it was amazing, we went to visit them, the ranger had the map of Geltsdale on his phone, and he could then move the zone for these collars around. He could actually just literally move it on his screen, and that would then change where the cattle went. So he's saying this was a bit of a game changer, because previously when they've tried this, it's been very expensive, in terms of you've had to have a herdsman there regularly. Otherwise, they did a lot of damage. The cattle will also damage young trees, etc. So that I thought was really interesting.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just trying to rush things on a bit here. We're going to run over maybe a couple of minutes. But another question by L. McLeod. We've managed to achieve regeneration on the estate. Our next challenge is the harvesting side. Are there any opinions on how we fell the overstory seed trees without causing too much damage to the young trees underneath? Now, David, I know you run Martelloscope training courses down at Stourhead. Do you want to say something on how we ensure that felling, skills with felling don't cause damage to the young trees and the poles underneath?
Yeah, well, In the regular structure, once you start to get trees coming up, which are going to recruit and become part of the sort of vertical structure, or even natural regeneration, when you get to natural regen going to saplings, what we do, and I think it's a good practice, is put in what we call permanent extraction racks at maybe intervals of between 20 and 30 meters. And what it means is then that the harvesting teams have to focus their machinery as much as they can on those roots to minimize impact and compaction of soil in between, in the matrix, as we call it, between, to protect the regeneration and the poles coming up and the trees for the future. And I think that that's, I don't know what density it is you're taking out, but you know, the idea then is that the motor manual guys will fell the trees out from the matrix if they're too big or too far away for the harvest machine to reach, and then towards the extraction rack, and then the harvest machine can reach them and process them from there, or if they're really big logs, they've got to be winched out. So it's trying to focus your machine traffic on limited routes, and then they become your permanent routes for the future.
Okay, Grant, thanks, David. There is actually a great video of some Swedish foresters. I'll see if I can post it in the link quickly, but there is a video of some trained foresters in Sweden, well, demonstrating exactly what you said. But their training, before they even go on the harvester, they have to do 2 years of forestry training. So, you know, quite highly skilled harvesters, but they enjoy it. Sounds like they really enjoy working in these mixed irregular forests where it's like minus 35. But great. Well, we've hit dead on 5:30. So I'd just like to say thank you to our panel for a really successful, what I think has been a really interesting, stimulating debate, question time. So thanks to David, Andrew and Hazel. Thank you very much indeed.